how many more to expect? Amy, do you think, which this is to Amy, I was thinking of Amy Joyce at this point. This is very
if you give us another 2 minutes or so, I think if we started around 3 or 4 minutes past, that will have given anyone plenty of time to have gotten here.
Okay.
I know that there seems to be some unwritten rule that nothing starts at exactly the hour, so let's wait until, give it another 1 minute or two.
Okay, no problem at all. I guess while we're waiting for folks to arrive, I could just give just a general overview as to what I thought, how we could kind of structure today's session. So, and again, I'll repeat this as we start to talk, but after I've done general introductions and introduced all three of us, I guess not all of you will know who we are. I have a few fairly big open questions that I'm going to put to my colleagues and try to chip in some answers myself. Since we are all art historians, we also have some images because we don't feel comfortable unless we have some images potentially to draw on. We may or may not use these, but we have a PowerPoint to hand. And I think possibly if we speak to specific images, we might be able to, we'll hopefully be able to call them up. But we'll be able to make use of the chat feature as well if we need to link to websites or other things. But we do have some images potentially to speak to. And the idea would be that we have a sort of fairly broad-ranging conversation, and then I guess shortly after 2:30 or so, we definitely open up to questions. You can either type questions in the chat, which I understand you should all have access to. It's the little speech bubble. So you should be able to, if you want to just write a question in there, please feel free to do so. Or you can do the little raise your hand button at the top, that little feature. And we definitely would love to see you to verbalise your comments if you would like to do that. I guess we'll wait another minute or so.
Yeah, I think you should be good to start anytime you want to, Kate. I think people will drop in dribs and drabs in the next 5 minutes or so, but I think we have a good kind of momentum of people to start off.
Excellent. Okay, terrific. Okay, well, welcome everybody to this, which is the fourth event in this Access All Areas series, which broadly has been interested, as those of you who've been to the other sessions in this series are aware, with considering the kind of relevance, status, history, the kind of future of area studies. And that's something that is certainly going to be circling around the things that we talk about today. So my name is Kate Cowcher. I am a lecturer in the art history department here at St Andrews. I've only been here for a couple of years, but I am very happy to have been invited by the Centre for Russian, Soviet, Central and Eastern European Studies to chair this session today. So before we get started, I do just want to thank Daria and Thomas, Victoria and Amy for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak with my colleagues Amy and Roz as well. So the focus today, as the title suggests, is on this kind of question of transnational and socialist art practices, and the two together. Socialist on the poster has been put in brackets because some of the time we are working on art that is not perhaps overtly socialist, but might be taking place in a kind of socialist context. We are all, I think, broadly interested in this question of the transnational, referring, of course, to the idea of extending beyond, operating across national borders, and of course the broader socialist politics of the 20th century and how these relate with the Cold War era in particular and its aftermath relate to questions of art making, circulation, consumption, and something we all share is an interest in the writing of art history. So to introduce my two colleagues, on the left of my screen, although I realise it might not be the same in yours, I have Professor Amy Bryzgel, who is full professor and chair in film and visual culture at the University of Aberdeen. She teaches broadly on modern and contemporary art, but her research focus is in Eastern European performance art, and she's the author of numerous articles and book chapters and 3 major monographs, including most recently Performance Art in Eastern Europe since 1960. And she's currently engaged in questions about teaching and mapping peripheral performance art histories, which is certainly something I hope we'll get a chance to get to. And then my other colleague at the University of St Andrews here, Dr Holmes, is lecturer in Chinese studies. In and of itself, amazing because you are an art historian in an area studies division. I'm somebody who engages with area studies, but within art history. Dr. Holmes's research focuses on art and visual culture in 20th century and contemporary China. She's particularly interested in interactions between the high and the low, popular and elite forms of cultural production, as well as intermedial and digital practices by a new generation of Chinese artists in the 80s and 90s. Her first book project is entitled The Art of Incivility, Rudeness and Representation in Contemporary China, and it engages a broad range of media to consider the emancipatory production of uncivil practices and dark humour. And your most recent research, if I understand correctly, is Somnolent States, a visual history of sleep in modern China. And this charts changing visualizations of sleep and sleeplessness in the early 20th century to the present, which also I think seems to tie in very nicely with questions and that obviously resonates with some of the socialist questions to do with art that we're discussing today. So as I said, I've got a few big, broad questions to kind of kick off with. My own research is based on the African continent, specifically in Ethiopia, where there was a revolution in 1974 which overthrew Haile Selassie and installed this Marxist-Leninist state. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is the different ways in which the question of the transnational might be relevant within Ethiopia. In the 1960s, before the revolution, Ethiopia is the first country on the African continent to get jet aeroplanes, and it very fervently embraces the jet age. It sends artists out into the world to study, but to also be ambassadors for their country. And it's those multiple journeys, very non-aligned in their reach, that really changed the politics in Ethiopia in the late 60s and the early 70s. But then the revolution in 74, the country firmly pivots towards the Eastern Bloc. And we have a very different sense of transnationalism at that moment in time, with their very keen engagement of exchange with Cuba, North Korea, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. So transnational has different resonances in the kind of couple of key decades in which I work. And I have some images to show, but I think I would like to open up to my colleagues first, just to share some introductory thoughts on where questions of the transnational fit with the sorts of work that you work on. So, Amy, would you like to kick off with some just initial thoughts on where this term, these ideas fit with all of the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kate. Sorry, I think I'm getting an echo. Is that all right now? Okay. Yeah, I mean, transnationalism is kind of at the heart of what I do. I mean, for those who are familiar with my book, that was very deliberately a broad look at performance art in Eastern Europe, but comparing the different situations in different countries across Eastern Europe and the different ways in which state-sponsored socialism was enacted. But I was also really interested in looking at the networks and the contacts across borders as well. And I think that looking at it in the post-socialist period as well, the directions in which artists are not only traveling but also looking, I think, is really interesting to look at. I mean, the question of being in area studies, though, in general, for me, has always been a peculiar one, I guess, because of and we've discussed this, last week, that, when you go to area studies conferences, the panels on art history and art and visual culture are quite few and far between, although that's definitely been increasing in the last few years, which is great. But I've always found, area studies, conferences kind of difficult to have that common ground. And that leaves art history in a strange, or it leaves the art history of Eastern Europe or the former communist countries in a peculiar place, because we don't really fit in art history either. We're also a subfield of art history. And it took me, I started my PhD in 2002, and no one in my art history department at Rutgers University had any idea what on earth I was doing. And it had been a steady fight since then. And I hear from younger scholars now that, I mean, it sounds like it's a little better, but not significantly. So this puts all of us in a really sort of nebulous, ambiguous place. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks so much, Amy. That really gets us into where our own work fits within both the discipline of art history, but also these kind of broader parameters of what's expected within area studies. And all of us, I think, are working in slightly different area studies fields, but that have clear overlaps with one another. Ros, did you want to come in with any initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with both of you, right, in terms of thinking about this idea of the transnational sort of border crossing, this not just this sort of cross-cultural migration of not just people, of artists themselves, but also sort of ideas and practices and images, and the new forms of art that also sort of engendered. Now, for me, I think as well, thinking about transnational also has to do with thinking about things beyond the nation and beyond the nation state itself. Yeah. I think especially in relation to China, where we see sort of discourses surrounding sort of mainland China really, really dominate. And I think it also sort of includes a far more sort of heterogeneous practices of artists operating in the Sinophone world more broadly. So for me, it's also about looking at artistic practices in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong and Southeast Asia and other sort of diasporic sites. And also sort of, non-Han groups within the borders of mainland China itself. And I think, really resonates with what both of you were saying is that, trying to counter this sort of continued insistence, this sort of categorizing these works, whether they're sort of Eastern European or works from Africa, or works from Asia, as somehow sort of being different or separate, right, from their sort of international counterparts. And I think the inherent danger in that is that, this difference is often being used as somehow as a euphemism, right, for somehow being sort of lesser or later from a Western standpoint, less modern, less contemporary, less cutting edge. And I think it's really played into, these instances of, from personal experience, Chinese contemporary art being sort of haunted by these spectres of sort of, some sort of inbuilt chronic delay, right? Yeah. That it's, it's somehow plagued by this sort of unidirectional flow of sort of art and information flowing from the West to the rest. And I think we really need to sort of get away from this idea of sort of center periphery dynamics, or this idea of looking at it only in relation to, those sort of power structures as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
These sort of broader conversations about, it's always been in dialogue with art and culture happening from all around the world. So,
within the field, so I teach at St Andrews, and my research is based in Ethiopia and this kind of era of internationalism with regard to Ethiopia's particular position in the world, which I think is extremely interesting. I teach quite broadly on the arts of the African continent. So I teach a class called African Modernisms in art history, and it deals with the kind of emergence of kind of modernist art, really, the early 20th century, but heavy emphasis on the era of independence and after, because exactly this same accusation of a sort of derivative art making is something that is obviously, put upon the African continent in very clear and often very offensive ways, in a way, not really taking the art of the continent very seriously, especially modern art. Even, in the 1960s, when this art first emerges, critics in Europe are simply describing this as a form of self-cultural colonialism. So part of the counter to that has been art historians like Chikere Agulu, heavily emphasizing the importance of the national project. So the emergence of the new nation state after colonialism, and so thinking about art and the nation in Nigeria, art and the nation in Senegal, art and part of what we're at now, 20 odd years since Chikere Agulu started those conversations, is thinking about the fact that we need to think beyond these nation state borders and to really actively engage questions of the transnational from a position of empowerment, so not as a kind of position of simply being influenced and having art that is simply derivative, but that obviously all of the artists in these countries are actively engaging the world on their own terms. And that's partially where my borderline obsession with Ethiopian Airlines has come from. I have next to me all the various things I buy on eBay, like Ethiopian Airlines 1960s drinks menus and this kind of stuff, just because I find it so amazing that this was such an important part of Ethiopia's position in the world in the 1960s, was utilizing what was the most cutting edge technology, Boeing fan jets, not just to take Ethiopia into the world, but to bring the world to Ethiopia on various holidays. And, so there's been this kind of interesting transnational turn, I think, within the kind of field of African art history recently, that in the last kind of few years, that really emphasizes this importance of looking at diplomacy and international engagement and exchange and all those sorts of things. Now, one of the things that I thought is interesting to perhaps consider, and I think, Amy, this particularly speaks to some of your work in terms of performance art, is these kind of questions of kind of official and dissident transnational engagements, right? So there is the Cold War itself, that within the kind of framework of the Cold War itself, the Soviet Union has, built into the Communist International or the proletariat internationalism, that there is this kind of official policy of engaging with the world. And the same with China was too. I was thinking the poster image, and maybe we'll pull up some images in a minute, the poster image of sort of solidarity with African nations, that there is a kind of official narrative of engagement and internationalism, but that I think both of you actually in each of your ways also deal with kind of transnational engagement as a sort of dissident practice, or a way of kind of critiquing what might be, the sort of hegemonic sort of narrative about transnationalism. Amy, I don't know if you want to come in with any thoughts on performance art in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the ways that the artists who weren't, accepted as official artists or promoted as official artists could engage transnationally, and it was because of the portability of their work. So because of the documentation, and this is interesting that you get these forms of performance art that are kind of a cross between mail art and performance art. Mm-hmm. And so they were using the documentation to send it abroad to participate in performance art festivals when they couldn't, actually travel. So you do have this transnational engagement on a very official level, but it rarely includes artists engaging in contemporary practices, except for the ones that the state liked to showcase internationally as a sign of being modern or progressive. And one person I'm thinking of in particular is not a performance artist, but he was very important for performance art. The Finnish-born Polish architect Oscar Hansen, who was known for this concept of open form. Mm-hmm. He wasn't allowed to teach architecture at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts because his ideas were too radical. And when I say too radical, what I mean is they were too socialist, like they were pure socialism. And that's what most of the dissident artists wanted. They were the ones who were holding the government to account, saying, we want actual socialism, like not the stuff you're doing. Mm-hmm. But his work was allowed to travel abroad at international exhibitions. And so he ended up just running a studio, like a sculpture workshop studio at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts, where he engaged the students in spatial activities. And then they were then inspired by those to go on and create performance art. And some of the most prominent performance artists in Poland came out of that studio. So it's interesting, these lines between official and unofficial, and what seeps out and what doesn't.
Yeah, I love this idea of it, like the contest over socialism as the very definition of the term, like who gets to define the terms, because certainly we see similar things in Ethiopia, where there's a sense that the revolution ultimately betrays any true socialism, that many of the artists of the 60s, particularly those who take opportunities to travel in the Eastern Bloc, have quite clear sense of what socialism is. And it isn't what the revolution then puts in place, that's a kind of dictatorial Marxism, which is not the same. It doesn't have the same emancipatory potential, I guess. So Ross, does this resonate with any of your work at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think this sort of binary between the official and the unofficial, and I think this definitely came to the fore because there's this sort of really heavily politicized understanding, I think, especially in relation to contemporary Chinese art, right? It came to be sort of seen in the global market as this sort of protest art, par excellence, that was really setting up these binaries between sort of dissident artists and authoritarian state, and, emancipation and versus restriction, and all these sort of things, which really still persist in a way, right? And I think it's also interesting what Amy was talking about, how the ground has really shifted as well, right? So even all these artists perhaps who in the 1980s and 90s were really framing themselves as, we are these sort of dissident, artists operating in these sort of underground, unofficial exhibitions. Mm-hmm. And now, they've very much also become like part of the establishment, right? So they're now like these high profile, artists who've gone on to become like head of the Central Academy of Fine Arts in China. They've got, people like Ai Weiwei who are very much enshrined in sort of the international art arena. So right. I think, it's really about, the way that it's still sort of framed. I think there's this idea, contemporary Chinese art is still very much about this repository of social political analysis in China. Right. And I think definitely still a legacy of that sort of Cold War paradigm, or this sort of idea of area studies as being intrinsically just about political science or economics, instead of looking at the more ingrained sort of cultural issues and about the voices of artists themselves, rather than this perpetual framing in a sort of very narrow, sort of restrictive vision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's definitely, I mean, in terms of the work that I do on the African continent, it's the discourse around Africa is so much that it's like this chessboard, and the Cold War sort of happened to it, and there are multiple ways in which that narrative is nuanced. Like, first of all, is obviously looking at the politics and the kind of positioning of African governments, but artists themselves have some important agency in this period, and they engage artistic practice in a way that, in the case of Ethiopia, they're negotiating not just with, the aftermath of the revolution in 1974, which ushers in a period of dictatorship, but also dealing with this relationship with the Soviet Union, with which Ethiopia is now hitched. So in the late 70s, the Soviet Union arrives with large amounts of money and support and huge numbers of student scholarships to allow young people to come to study in Moscow and Leningrad and other places. And so you have artists who are trying to negotiate between the Ethiopian state's expectations, this foreign sponsors' expectations, and their inclination perhaps is to suggest that artists are somehow powerless in this situation, or they have to occupy a permanent state of dissidence and resistance, without recognizing that there's a lot of negotiation, I guess, that happens. There's a lot of kind of there are choices that are made, and there's also agonizing too. I mean, and that's the case in Ethiopia with regard to maybe like realist painting, for example, which is something that's seen as a dictated art form and a foreign art form. But in actual fact, for a lot of artists in Ethiopia, it's appealing, and so there's a kind of complexity as to the appeal of that practice. Actually, I mean, that must resonate a little with performance art too, right? Does that get seen as this foreign practice? Does that, or is it, is there a way in which, the practitioners in Eastern Europe kind of, are they taking inspiration from New York and other places? And sort of how do they negotiate that?
It's really interesting. I mean, I will say that for example, in the 90s, what you were just talking about now about it, being very attractive and almost being imposed. In the 90s in Estonia, for example, you have this phenomenon where like banks are commissioning works of performance art because it's so avant-garde, and artists are trying to go back into their histories and point to performances, I was doing this back then. But during the 60s and 70s, artists, I've talked to them a lot about this, and in most cases, it seems like they really came to performance art on their own. Of course, they were aware of things that were going on, and there were certain books that were well circulated. One is that I've heard a million times is Alan Caprow's Assemblages, Environments, Happenings. They all had a copy of that. But what a lot of them will tell me was that they started doing performances, actions, it started really with happenings. And then they would come across an article in an art journal or something and see that, other artists were doing this abroad as well. Mm-hmm. And it was like confirmation of what they were doing. But then you can't deny the impact of things like the Ford Foundation scholarships, for example, through which a number of Polish artists traveled to the U.S. That's how Tadeusz Kantor traveled to the U.S. and Natalia LL. And Kantor was a theater director. So then you have the, movement towards performance in, from the direction of theater as opposed to the visual arts. So I see it as something that emerged concurrently with what was going on in the West. Mm-hmm. There was a little bit of, taking from artists as well. But I also am interested in how artists from Eastern Europe may have influenced artists in the West by bringing their ideas. And there are cases of people commenting on, what they're doing, over there, that's really quite unique. So, so that transnationalism started, long ago with that.
And remembering the kind of bidirectional nature of it, I think, is really key. So this idea that the influence goes the other way is that's part of what the important work that you're doing right now is mapping, Amy. So
Yeah.
Ross, did you want to come in at all on this question?
Yeah, just to echo that, really. I mean, some of the slides I think I showed at the beginning is also thinking about those transnational histories, the transcultural flow stuff, even sort of.
Ross, should we open that PowerPoint so you can see? I don't know on my computer. I don't know if Dario, if you want to do it. I don't know. I think I've got it open on my screen, so I can literally just share it so that everyone can see it.
Yes, maybe we can speak to some of the images if you can bring it up. So there's one. Yes, I think image that you just showed of. Let's see.
Is this the one? I think actually this PowerPoint doesn't have my images in it, so we'll switch to the other one in a minute to show Ethiopian images. But is this? Can you see your slide now, Rose?
I can see yours. Oh, let me go forward. All right, hold on a second. It's loading. Okay, so I mean, these were just a few examples that I put together. So this is a painting by a female artist called Guanzilan, and this is from 1920 Shanghai. Shanghai at that point was one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world, right? It's not just a home; it's home to artists from all over the world as well, right? So thinking about most people perhaps when they see this image for the first time, they say, oh well, this looks like a Fauvist image, right? Or it looks like something produced by Matisse. When actually thinking about those reciprocal ideas that we sort of talked about, right? Guanzilan was an artist. She was trained in Shanghai. She was part of this group called the Storm Society. It was one of the earliest sort of avant-garde groups in Shanghai at that time. She traveled extensively in Japan as well. So it's thinking not just about Europe, right, or about Russia. There was lots of artists who also trained in Russia, but also about Japan and other points of Asia as well, which also served as these sort of mediations of cultural contacts and sort of flows between that. Mm-hmm. Our next image is this one by Li Hua, which is War China, right? Which is one of the most sort of iconic images in 20th century China. It's really seen as this being sort of moment when, in terms of anti-Japanese sort of sentiment, in relation to the invasion of China by Japan. But it's not just, it's about personifying China as this sort of reaching back to sort of grab this knife to sort of liberate itself, right? But this was very much, the title of the work itself even comes from a Russian play that was produced by Tretyakov, a year before. A lot of these artists were also looking at sort of German expressionist prints too, so works by people such as Kata Kollwitz. So again, this idea of this transcultural sort of flow of ideas and the sort of images that were in circulation, this sort of prints and books and pictorials and where all this stuff, this flow of information was coming from. But it's always been about what we're talking about, this transcultural flow of images from around the world. Even this image that you talked about, Kate, briefly as well. So thinking about this idea of the Cultural Revolution, right, which lots of people think is this sort of really isolationist period in China's history, when in fact, of course, there was loads of artists from all over the world who were in China at that time, whether it was sort of Mexican mural artists or also sort of prominent African-American activists and intellectuals, and imagining sort of China's role within this sort of broader vision of sort of worldwide sort of anti-capitalist coalition, right, against sort of racism and imperialism. So I think it's also about, tracing those complex networks, those interactions, and exchange of ideas, which was happening on definitely a very sort of global scale.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this poster is so fascinating because obviously there are so many similar ones that we see in the Soviet Union as well, of kind of images of solidarity and kind of fascinating stories about some of those images, of course, then leading into rather paternalistic attitudes towards the African continent that jar for many of the students who travel from the African continent to Moscow and Leningrad, the experience of it rather jars with some of the imagery that there, has been has circulated. So in Ethiopia, for example, there's a sort of massive influx of books and publications and other things from the Soviet Union that kind of celebrates this idea of international friendship and kind of, brotherhood of nations and all this kind of stuff. But when Ethiopian artists arrive in Moscow and Leningrad, they experience this intense othering for the first time in their life, which speaks to some degree to the kind of complexities of Ethiopia's position on the African continent, thinking of itself as a continental leader, the only African nation that defeated European colonizers when they beat the Italians in the 1890s. Thought of itself, a lot of the artists arrive in Russia and are surprised to be categorized as just African, as the same as an artist from the Congo in Nigeria, because they have arrived with a sense of hierarchy to some degree, and that this speaks to some of the kind of complexities around identification, and then somewhat alienating experience when you're actually at art school. And there are some, if I can take control and go back through again, it's just loading to, these are from the 60s, but this image here. So here, exactly. So the Festival of Youth in '57, there were Ethiopian students who participate in the Festival of Youth in Moscow. But the sort of most significant wave of Ethiopian students going to the Soviet Union is in the 70s and the 80s. So they actually arrive in the sort of perestroika period, in the kind of later period. And someone like Bekele Makonnen here on the right, he particularly speaks in the late 1980s to it being a very difficult experience to be there. But yet, nonetheless, we can see, even in contemporary art today in Ethiopia, the legacies of really sort of rigorous studio art training in this kind of intense realist painting that we see in Ethiopia. There's a strong interest to this day in giant, large-scale epic paintings that are enormously laborious to paint. But the interesting thing with a piece like this by Mezgebu Tesema, who was one of the very last Ethiopian students to go and study in the late 1980s in the Soviet Union, that actually he, I think, plays with the very definition of the word realism in the Ethiopian language Amharic, which in the revolution is defined as onatoinat, meaning truth or truthfulness. So the real and the truthful are kind of allied as part of this revolutionary thrust. But actually these paintings, which are absolutely enormous at the size of a wall, when you stand in front of them, they're extremely dizzying. And actually what you see is not so much a kind of reality, but an illusion, and the use of a kind of extreme realism as a form of kind of illusory painting, playing with a kind of dizzying depth. But you can't really understand this kind of contemporary art practice in Ethiopia unless you really think about the legacies of those periods of exchange and kind of circulation. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Amy, did you want to talk about any of the images in your slides before we turn to those questions?
No, I really just brought those as an in case. I'm happy to just keep talking and go to the chat. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's turn off the presentation maybe for a second and just kind of talk about some of those questions. Or maybe I'll leave it open in case we want to refer to it. So question from Victoria on the dissident official art question. I'm interested to hear about your understanding of your own roles in formalizing art practice, determining who and what become institutionally recognized. In this way, how are your area studies, West-East or West-South, how your area studies informs and shifts the understanding of what constitutes dissident or official art in the places that you study? Amy, I don't know. Do you want to take that to start with, or Roz? Either of you actually, if you're interested in kind of thinking about, the ways in which our own approaches to kind of area studies, I guess, how that kind of shifts the understanding of what constitutes official or dissident art in these places.
Did you want to go, Roz? I've been going first. I want to make sure you have the opportunity for the first word too. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for me, it's ridiculous how this is a really resilient thing, right? Which seems to be going on, right? I mean, lots of people have talked about this idea of Chinese art is still sort of framed by these sort of binaries which still operate, right? The sort of dissidence hypothesis, the fact that a lot of artists who came to prominence was because they were doing what was called sort of, made in China sort of paintings, right? So, perhaps we can talk a little bit about institutional critique. If I go to a specific image, I can show you of an artist who really got fed up with this idea that Chinese contemporary art is just all about sort of protest art. So if we look at this image by Yanlei, which is called "Please, may I see your work?" And in it, he sort of takes this photograph of Walter Zapp, who was this Latvian creator of the Minox, which is this sort of spy camera, which you see sort of play out in lots of films. It's sort of endlessly portrayed, and he sort of reframes it by sort of saying, "Can I sort of see your work?" So he's really sort of satirizing this idea of these sort of Western curators that would rock up in China in the 1990s, let's say mostly men, mostly all white. They would do these sort of whirlwind studio tours, right, where they would go to, Chinese artist studios. They would, pick a couple of, paintings, maybe some images of Mao, some couple, images of pandas, and it was like, voila, an exhibition of contemporary Chinese art, and I think this was really sort of done to death throughout the 1990s, and still is, this idea of it's only as well if you have access to English, if you can speak English, that you're able to converse with these people. It's also about this power structures, which I think are really embedded within a lot of these sort of continuing sort of dialogues. And I think the voices, as you said, the voices of artists really get lost in that, right? Because it really splits things down into these binaries and there's no nuance. So I think, you know, maybe part of our job as well as art historians is to really think about, you know, agency and all that, you know, really about putting the voices of Chinese artists more to the forefront, right? Instead of it continuously being about this repository of socio-political analysis or being framed in a very, very specific way, that we need to think about, you know, how are these art histories being written? There's another work by Luding called Omission is the Beginning of History Writing. So again, this sort of idea of critiquing, right, how do these histories get written? He has this sort of book of Chinese contemporary art with this sort of uncertain beginning and this already planned ending. And it's about going back and thinking about, you know, who's writing these histories as well, you know, where are the voices of Chinese artists within that? And are we perhaps in this rush to write this history of contemporary Chinese art before its footnotes have been given adequate time to form, or before we really have looked in this in a much broader way and really thought about how inclusive, you know, is that history in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are urgent questions around the relevance of various studies. I mean, within anything related, of course, to the African continent, this is a huge question, because African studies as a discipline is one that there's a huge contest over in the 50s and 60s in the United States, where, you know, white American scholars really seem to have all the power, partly because the government invests heavily in research institutions rather than historically black universities and colleges. So, you know, the power and resources go to white researchers, and this has created a situation, obviously, within African studies where the position of African voices is notably absent. But it's important, actually, even within this, to recognise that in the 60s itself, this is a question. So there are a series of conferences on the African continent in the 1960s, including one in Addis Ababa, actually, just the year before the revolution, that is exactly debating, you know, who has the right to write these histories and who should be writing these histories, and trying to take back the notion of an Africanist historical practice. So the current debates and discussions about this are 50, 60 years old. This is not a kind of new discussion, but the balance of power remains problematic, shall we say. But that kind of goes to another question on the list about, you know, other things like social media and other ways, I guess, of kind of sharing and capturing. Kind of, Thomas asked, Sean, I'm not ignoring your question. I realise I've jumped over it. I'll come back to it in just a second. You know, the ways in which kind of social media, Instagram and other things have kind of captured post-socialist spaces. And certainly, you know, Instagram in particular has been is just a very, very important platform for artists on the African continent who are, you know, as a way of promoting work and directing the discourse around their work as well. So particularly artists in Ghana, Senegal, Ethiopia, these are places where there are a very there's a very lively contemporary art scene that uses social media very extensively to kind of and particularly in the case of Ghana, to kind of deal with not just the contemporary scene, but the writing of the history of that moment, sort of leading up to now. Amy, have you got any thoughts on this idea of kind of, alternative voices and the writing of history and?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to follow on from what Roz was saying, because it's that was one of the things that was so important to me, you know, when I was writing my book, The Performance Art in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, when the question was, you know, how do you think about your impact on the places that you study? And that has always been so much in the forefront of my mind. I mean, there's such a complex issue. When I first went to Latvia, I had people telling me that I really couldn't write the history of Latvian art. I wasn't trying to write the history of Latvian art, but, you know, I couldn't write about Latvian art because you can't write about it if you don't understand living under communism, which I found surprising because I don't know a lot of Renaissance art historians who've lived through the Renaissance. But I understood I got what they were saying. And I think it was also because Latvia was, was brought into the Soviet Union against its will. Mm-hmm. So it has a different, relationship with that. But I mean, one of the things I really tried to do in my book was give those voices to the artists. And it's always hard because you have to, you feel like you have to give some attention to the sort of big hits, the people, the big names. But I made a very, I made a very concerted effort in my book to include artists that were really not well known at all or heard of. And I was just going on I was choosing to include the artists in my book whose work I found compelling and interesting. And, I hope that is a good, maybe a nice alternative to the ones whose work looks most like Western art or least like Western art, or the most socialist, or, the ones that have had commercial success. And just to bring it back to the social media discussion, I mean, social media was so important in my research because what I would basically do was, I would look, when I was going to a country, I would look up, obviously there was a few names of artists that I knew I wanted to meet, but then I would just go on social media. I would contact people through Facebook. When I was going to Albania, I couldn't get in touch with anyone. So I just put a post out on Facebook saying, hey, does anyone know any artists in Albania? And, that worked. So, I mean, that does give the artists a bit more agency and since starting my I had a website, well, I still have it, but it's not very active. Artists would get in touch with me and say, hey, have you heard, what about, have you heard of my work? Would you like to hear about it? And I'm always like, yes, of course. I want to hear about all interesting artists. So it is a very complex issue with regard to who writes the history.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I found interesting when I was in Addis was also a question of what histories of art were being used. And obviously, Amy, you're saying that Alan Kaprow's book is circulating in Eastern Europe, which is really fascinating. When I was in Addis, I was so amazed to go to this one artist studio, and he had most of the history of art books he had were in Russian because he bought them in Moscow, having done his language training there, and bought them in the 80s. And he was busy writing a textbook on the history of art in Ethiopia that was basically drawing on Russian histories of art from the 60s and 70s. And this is how I sort of got on my kick of trying to understand the different framings of history of art on the continent that come out of that kind of Cold War framing, but also recognizing that for an Ethiopian artist, the Russian model was actually more attractive than the kind of European or American model, the European one being steeped in kind of primitivism and the kind of legacies of colonialism. What the Ethiopians were really excited about was the Soviet project of writing this kind of giant narrative of a history of art, which would put Ethiopia as one of the origin points because it has an ancient civilization. And so from an Ethiopian perspective, the framework was more attractive than the kind of European framing that was steeped in the kind of legacies of colonialism and things. So I find that the recognizing the kind of the sources that are informing that history of art writing on the ground is really important as well. We have, I want to go back to Sean's question, which is, and I think this definitely is something that both of you can speak to in terms of your relative context. But Sean asked, it'd be interesting to hear about the role of the commercial art market in promoting a more transnational approach to socialist art. And the first thing that this made me think of, well, in both of your cases, obviously, with Roz, the first thing this made me think of is that, of course, the art market jumps all over Chinese art political pop, right? So the stuff that looks like a kind of, it seems to conform to certain stereotypes about the Cultural Revolution, but seems a bit dissident. And so actually the commercial art market seems not so interested in transnational, but in a kind of distinctly Chinese version of socialist art, and maybe a kind of, another national context version of socialist art. And in your case, Amy, I'm fascinated with your discussion about performance art. I was reading some of your writings on the kind of the sort of reenactment of performance, and the idea that, of course, initially performance art in the West, is about circumventing an art market. It's deliberately designed to kind of, refute capitalism. In the East, of course, there isn't an art market to circumvent. So instead, it's a kind of critique of politics and and kind of government structures in general. But so I thought, I mean, I would be interested to know what either of you would think about the kind of contemporary commercial art market and its interest or not in a question of a kind of transnational approach to socialist art. Ros, I don't know if you have any thoughts about China with that regard.
Oh, definitely, right? I think that the contemporary art market, global, has got a lot to answer for, right? I think this is why we say to most people, like, name a contemporary Chinese artist, who's the first person they're going to mention? You know, it's either going to be like Ai Weiwei or Cai Guotang, right? And these are the main people who are sort of, you know, continuously on the walls and the halls of, you know, the Tate Modern or Guggenheim and everywhere else, right? And I think this is also like a broader question, which is really about what classifies as like contemporary art, right? You know, who gets to decide what's included within those categories, right? It's a very specific branding in a way as well. I mean, actually within mainland China at the moment, I mean, some of the people who command the biggest prices at auction houses, at Chinese auction houses, are actually producing stuff which is maybe not even classified as contemporary art, even though it's contemporary, right? So you think about contemporary Buddhist art, right? Or contemporary ink painting, you know, or, you know, even contemporary propaganda, right? We think about contemporary art as being this really broad, capacious category about how it's very equal, it's very globalized, but actually there's whole swathes of art that don't even get talked about in those contexts at all, right? Yeah. And I think that does, you know, again, it's about reinforcing those sort of power structures and those paradigms about, you know, what is popular, who gets to decide what's popular and what's not, who gets to decide, you know, this international, you know, art world access and you know, what happens to artists, you know, when they want to break into that international art world. Is it, you know, that they're told as well this idea of gatekeeping and being forced to sort of conform to these ideas of what, you know, contemporary art is or should be, or what it should look like, you know, and how they should act. I mean, I think Ai Weiwei is obviously a very sort of divisive figure in some ways, but you know, whenever he was in China, it was like, oh well, you're producing work which just panders to a Western audience, right? And it's just very much about sort of fitting a certain ideal of what contemporary art should be. And then when he goes abroad, it's like, oh well, you're producing art which is, you know, not Western, you know, it's not Western enough, i.e. it's just sort of derivative, or it's also not Chinese enough, right? We want you to be a Chinese dissident artist, so we want you to talk about Chinese social, you know, problems. But the minute that he starts talking about the refugee crisis in Europe, it's like, oh no, we want you to be a Chinese dissident artist. I sort of know your place, Chinese stuff, but don't lecture us about the other things.
Yeah,
you can't win, right? I mean, I can understand.
Any sense of nuance around a transnational socialist practice is not going to come from the art market. It's not going to be driven by the sale of artworks per se. Amy, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well, because I mean, you also work on art that is not easily commodifiable, you know, is not something that necessarily trades in the art market, but is nonetheless shaped by it, right? So
yeah, no, I mean, I have so little faith in the art market, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this story of when was it Christie's? No, it was the other auction house. I'm losing my memory, but I'm losing my memory for names. But anyway, so Sotheby's. Sotheby's went into Moscow in 1988 or something. I think it was 88. And, you know, they had this big sale of avant-garde art. And then at the end, they had some of the, you know, the non-conformist art, because this was the time of perestroika. And what is the author's name? Andrew Solomon. He was a journalist in Russia at the time, and he wrote this book. It's called The Irony Tower, and he talks about how, you know, the artists were just sitting there shocked because they thought for sure. Well, first of all, they were all talking about, oh, I wonder how much this artist will get, or this artist, and it was the artists that they thought were so great and talented that didn't sell at all, and the people who they thought their work wasn't that great that sold, you know, really well. And so the art market, you know, as much as art historians are to blame for creating canons and you know, reinforcing canons, the market is as much to blame for that. So you know, and it's really, then it becomes about who has access to the West, even in the post-socialist space. You know, the young artist from Moldova is not going to have as much of a chance at getting into, you know, a Western art academy, et cetera, et cetera. Curators aren't going to go to Moldova. So, you know, then there's this question of access. So I think it's highly, highly problematic. The market is places these arbitrary value. Well, I think they're arbitrary values on art that I really, I mean, I'm interested in studying them, but I'm not really interested in engaging with them.
Yes, indeed.
Just if I can add to that, Andrew Solomon also went to China, and there's also paintings where artists critiqued him as like Columbus discovering a new continent, because he also wrote these like awful articles in the New York Times. So yeah, he went everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, critics and the art market aligned in creating. Exactly. I mean, yeah, art historians get the flack for these canon creations, but actually, yeah, the art market and critics have a lot to answer for as well. Amy, you have written rather, Amy Joyce, I should say, you've written rather cryptically in the chat. Have a question about border crossing, transnational art and diaspora. Would you like to ask that vocally?
Yes, apologies for the cryptic message. I apparently am I'm not very good at like phrasing my ideas in short bursts of text in the way that everyone else are. But I really enjoyed, and I'm enjoying the whole conversation, but particularly what Roz was saying about kind of thinking beyond the nation state when we talk about transnationalism. And this might relate a little bit to Lynn's question as well, so perhaps you can take them together.
Yeah, great.
You know, we tend to think about diasporic artistic communities in these kind of long-term ideas, you know, so if you look at kind of Endwieser's Biennale and stuff like that, it's this idea of like established diasporic communities. But one of the things, and this kind of goes to your discussion about the market as well, and Amy's point about who has access to the West, and Roz's point about the strictures or the confinement of contemporary art, you have these kind of fast-paced diasporic communities as well, where for short periods of time, you know, people gather around specific events within across the globe, and increasingly the question of like, how do you manage this kind of post-socialist context within this very flattening global art world approach to, well, now we do contemporary art and everything's equal. And so I suppose I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the way in which engaging in these kind of fast-paced, short-lived diasporic, either in art schools or at art events, is having an influence on the kind of conversations about socialism that are happening in transnational art. And as I said, I think this probably relates quite closely to what Lynn was asking.
Mm-hmm. And that question is in the chat, and wondering to what extent are artists from socialist countries able to transform the whole context by creating artworks and their labour to capitalism. I mean, I think that's, you know, in terms of the kind of Cold War-ish context that I'm working, or that I have worked in, it is these really short, you know, it's like 3 years or something like that, less than that, 3 or 4 years in a place. But it seems to have had a kind of generational impact on conversations about art certainly in the city of Addis Ababa. But that's not the only overseas visit, right? And that's partially why I'm interested in looking a lot further back in time and looking at things like the Jet Age and other things that provide these kind of moments of kind of international engagement that sort of precede those overseas study trips in the 1970s, but also which precede like the contemporary biennial moment, which is very, very temporary. Like it's these kind of, you know, temporary instantiations of artistic exhibitions that seem to sort of, you know, suggest that we live in a more global moment right now, but forget that there are nonetheless these kind of temporary engagements of a few months or a couple of years that have gone on, you know, in multiple contexts over the course of the second half of the 20th century. Roz or Amy, I don't know if you want to come in and speak to Amy's idea about this this kind of concept.
Well, I don't know, we tend to think about biennalization as banalization, how it all becomes really banal, right? Because you get this sort of like corporate glossing over where all art just somehow just ends up looking the same, right? There's this type of art which sort of circulates in these endless sort of big art fairs and biennales, and it's usually always the same people and the same galleries and the same sort of things. So it really doesn't in any way give the sort of accurate picture, if there is such a thing as an accurate picture, of what's actually going on the ground, right? Or how artists actually feel about their own practice, or how they relate themselves as well within those sort of networks.
Yeah.
So again, it's, I don't know, I mean, this idea of globalization is sort of flattening out, when of course, you know, as Amy was just saying, right, it's actually riven with all these sort of, you know, hidden power inequalities and structures, and about, you know, who are the gatekeepers and processes of canonization. Yeah. And these are issues which have obviously, you know, been, you know, throughout the 20th century and beyond, and I think which still are operational, right? They still continue, I think, to really impact the way, you know, that even contemporary art in China. I mean, I work a lot as well in sort of digital intermedial practices, and again, there's these sort of really sensationalized reports around, oh, you know, the internet in China is so different. It's nothing but this sort of barren wasteland that's been censored to the point of sterility. When of course the opposite is true, right? But we just tend to focus on, you know, people talk about, oh, Google is, you know, is blocked or banned, or you can't access Twitter, you can't access Facebook. Well, no, because people just use completely different platforms, right? And we tend to focus on what is absent rather than actually what's visually present, right? It seems to be these sort of sensationalized reports rather than actually thinking about what's actually there and looking at it in a lot more depth. I think there's this idea of sort of just this superficiality, right? The sort of glossing over of all this stuff rather than a more sort of engaged interaction.
Yeah, can you, if you've got the GIF piece, or the piece that's moving, because you've written about that, that's really interesting. Do you want to talk about this, because I think this speaks a bit to this, no?
Right, so this is for, a screenshot of a Bilibili video. So these are sort of what's called danmu, or sort of bullet comment videos. And this is really, really popular form of sort of interaction in China, where basically people just overlay text. So they're watching the video and then you can type in and it sort of appears in this sort of palimpsestic image sort of text interplay, right? And these are, you know, really, really popular. As I said, you can now have bullet screen cinemas, you know, people watch these videos all the time. But this is something that, you know, when you show it, I think first people that have never seen bullet screen or bullet comments before find this, you know, completely disoriented, and they're like, what is sort of going on here? And actually it's because there's this range of sort of digital interlinked services which is currently far more advanced than anything that we have outside of China. But people still can think about it in these really sort of weird Cold War sort of clash of civilization sort of ways, right? Where it's like, who's going to become the next big tech player, and it's all about, you know, America versus China, and these really, you know, sort of resilient Cold War politics, which is really, I don't know, I just find it really bizarre. But I think it plays into this idea of sort of, you know, again, this idea of sort of espionage, and this idea of sort of China as this, you know, global and political threat in a way, which really colours and taints, I think, a lot of artistic, especially contemporary artistic production too.
Yeah, Amy, did you have any, because I realise we're coming up on time pretty much. Do you have any other thoughts? I
just wanted to say quickly, because we were talking about biennales, that's one of the great areas that performance artists have used to hijack biennales. So there are a number of instances by artists from Albania, Kosovo, Bulgaria, Moldova, where they hijack the spaces of particularly the Venice Biennale and do performances in those spaces, right? Because of course, none of those countries have pavilions in the Giardini, so they're always peripheral pavilions anyway. So they'll hijack something going on within the main pavilions, and it's a great way for, you know, performance artists to have visibility. How that impacts more widely, I don't know, but I like it as a subversive practice. So.
Yeah, no, definitely, absolutely. I don't know, Amy, Joyce, or Daria. Really, I'm assuming we need to wrap up now. Do we need to wrap up? It's 3 o'clock. Or how does this normally run?
Yeah, I think normally at the end we just give a chance for you to kind of summarize maybe or finish up, but we tend to try and finish just before 3 so that people can get to their next excessive Zoom/Teams call.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, obviously this has been a pretty wide-ranging conversation that has taken us to quite different contexts. And I think that the general overarching theme certainly seems that there needs to be an attentiveness to the kind of complexity and nuance of the transnational, but also in the case of, you know, this image that we're currently seeing, you know, Roz's sort of emphasis on not continuing to perpetuate, you know, Cold War frameworks or the center periphery narrative that completely ignores the nuance and complexities of particular locales. Amy or Roz, did you want to add anything finally, summing up any of your comments or thoughts on the discussion?
I think, I'll just come in quickly to say that I think, you know, the artists have this figured out way better than any of us, because they consider themselves transnational, and they're not thinking in these, well, the ones that I've spoken to are not thinking in these silos. So I think the more we look to the artists, the more and the better answers that we'll get.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Roz, any final thoughts or a bullet comment?
Just to echo that, well, I mean, like bullet comments too, right? It's about listening to all the voices out there, right? Not just having one voice at a time, but really trying to have this sort of ongoing dialogue, right? And seeing how these things really sort of play out, you know, and also being conscious, as we sort of said, of what voices are given prominence while others are not. You know, it's really about trying to engage as many people in that conversation as possible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is, I guess, our hope moving forward in terms of how art history and area studies might work with one another in what has not always been the easiest of relationships, perhaps. I think we're probably at time there. So, Amy, Joyce, or should we wrap it up here?
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Just a very brief thing at the end to remind everyone that we have another, the next in this series is on energy, and I think it's actually titled Energy Humanities, and that's going to be on the 12th of April at 2 o'clock, so kind of the same time. We'll have all the information on that coming out on the website and on Twitter, and also this video will be available, and we'll put it up online once we've figured out and edited it in the way that we need. Thank you so much for what has been, at least for me, and I'm sure for everyone else, a really fascinating conversation. I have so many questions, but I know that I don't have any opportunity to ask them, so expect me to bother you with emails.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure that all three of us would be happy to answer things. Like,
yeah,
please.
And I'd like to thank everyone for their participation and fantastic questions in the chat as well. And thank you all for coming along to this event. We have been really enjoying them, and it's great to see the range of people turning out to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot for having us. And yeah, be in touch with any of us if there are any further questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.